You said less in that meeting today. You laughed a little quieter at dinner last night. Nobody asked where you had been, and nobody seemed to notice you had barely spoken in days. That silence sat heavier than any argument ever could. Being invisible does not feel like anger from other people. It feels like proof. Proof that you have somehow stopped mattering to people you assumed would notice you were gone. You have tried to explain it away. Maybe you are overthinking. Maybe everyone is simply busy. But part of you already suspects this quiet has a shape, and it started around the same time a certain number began appearing everywhere you looked. Here is the first answer. That number is not comforting you by accident. It is marking a season where your presence is being quietly withdrawn from people who were never meant to witness what comes next. This is not punishment. It is preparation. And there is a second layer to it most people never uncover. What that pattern is actually doing and why it chose you now is what the rest of this comes down to. The moment no one noticed you leave the room. There is a specific kind of pain in leaving somewhere and realizing nobody registered it. Not the party, not the group chat, not the family dinner where you excused yourself early and no one texted to ask why. You keep replaying it. You look for the moment where you became optional. Was it something you said? Was it something you stopped saying? Most people search for a single cause, a single mistake, a single conversation that changed everything. But that search usually leads nowhere, because the shift was rarely one event. It was a slow erosion, a gradual quieting of your presence in rooms that used to feel like yours. This is where most people misread what is happening to them. They assume invisibility means they have done something wrong. They assume it means they are less interesting, less worthy, less necessary than they used to be. So they perform harder. They speak louder in meetings. They post more. They try to reinsert themselves into spaces that have already started to feel foreign. And here is the part almost nobody tells you. Performing harder does not restore visibility. It usually deepens the exhaustion, because you are now fighting against a current that was never about your effort in the first place. Think about the timing. Invisibility rarely arrives at random moments. It tends to arrive right before a shift in identity, right before a relationship ends or begins, right before a version of you that no longer fits. The old room is about to step forward. The people around you sense that shift before you consciously do. Something in your energy has already started changing, and they are responding to a person who is quietly becoming someone else. This is not about blame. It is not about who stopped caring first. It is about timing that your conscious mind has not caught up to yet. Consider how many times a friendship faded right before you moved, or right before you changed careers. It often happened right before your beliefs shifted in a way that no longer matched the group you were in. The fading felt premature at the time. Looking back, it made sense. The room and the person walking through it were no longer the same shape. This is the layer most people never explore, and it changes how the entire experience should be read. You are not disappearing because you failed. You are disappearing because a version of you is already retiring, quietly, before the new one has fully arrived. That in-between space is uncomfortable. It has no name that feels flattering. It looks like being forgotten. It feels like being erased. But structurally, it behaves more like a corridor than a conclusion. There is a reason a specific pattern keeps surfacing during exactly this kind of corridor. It shows up in phone numbers, on receipts, on clocks you happen to glance at, during the exact minutes you feel most unseen. That timing is not coincidence stacked on coincidence. It is a marker, and understanding what it marks changes how the silence around you should actually be interpreted. The next layer explains why that marker chose this particular moment in your life, and why the silence around you might be doing something far more specific than simply confirming your fear of being forgotten. The number. Waiting behind the silence. Think back to the last time you felt truly overlooked. Now think about what was on the clock, the receipt, the license plate, the page number you happened to glance at in that exact stretch of time. For a specific group of people going through this exact kind of quiet, the number that keeps surfacing is 777, not 111, not 333, specifically 727, appearing in clusters right when the isolation feels heaviest, right when you are questioning whether anyone would notice if you simply stopped showing up at all. 777 does not carry the same tone as most repeating numbers. It is not a warning. It is not asking you to fix something broken. Numerology traditions going back centuries associate the number 7 with completion, with an internal process finishing a cycle that began long before you were consciously aware of it. Tripled, it intensifies. It stops being a suggestion and becomes a statement. Here is where this stops being generic and becomes specific to what you are living through right now. When 777 appears during a season of feeling unseen, it is rarely commenting on your worth to other people. It is marking the completion of a version of you that depended on being seen by them in the first place. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Most people interpret invisibility as a verdict on their value. 777 is suggesting something closer to a graduation, one that happens to feel like loss because you have not yet met the person who no longer needs that specific audience to feel real. And this is where most people misread the entire pattern. They assume the goal is to become visible again to the exact same people, in the exact same way as quickly as possible. That is not what this number is pointing toward. It is pointing toward a different kind of visibility, one built on a foundation those old rooms were never designed to hold. There is a psychological mechanism underneath this that mirrors the spiritual one closely. Researchers who study identity transitions describe a phase called social disengagement, where a person unconsciously withdraws from relationships and environments that no longer match who they are becoming. The withdrawal often happens before the person can articulate why. Other people feel the shift as distance. The person experiencing it feels it as confusion, sometimes as grief. Carl Jung wrote about a similar pattern he called individuation, the process of a person separating from the identity shaped by others in order to become who they actually are underneath it. He noted that this separation almost always includes a period that looks from the outside like withdrawal or disappearance. 777 arriving during that exact window is not decoration. It is confirmation that the corridor you are standing in has a structure, a beginning, and an end, even when it does not feel like it from the inside. But naming the number is only the surface of what is happening here. The deeper question is why some people move through this corridor quickly while others stay trapped in it for years, repeating the same invisible season without ever completing it. That difference has almost nothing to do with luck, and almost everything to do with a single misunderstanding examined next. Why being overlooked can be a form of protection. There is a version of this experience that almost never gets talked about, mostly because it sounds counterintuitive the first time you hear it. Sometimes you are not being pushed out of a room. You are being quietly kept out of one that would have cost you something you cannot yet see. Consider the group that stopped inviting you right before a decision that, in hindsight, would have pulled you into months of conflict. Consider the relationship that faded right before it would have asked you to shrink yourself permanently to keep the peace. From the inside, both looked like rejection. From a wider angle, both look like a door closing before you walked through it. This is not a comfortable idea to sit with. It asks you to consider that some of your most painful periods of feeling unseen were doing something on your behalf, without your permission, and without your understanding. Emotional withdrawal from other people often precedes a decision your nervous system made before your conscious mind caught up. Psychologists who study self-protective behavior describe this as an unconscious retreat. It is a pulling back from environments that demand a version of you incompatible with where you are headed. Here is the detail that changes how you should read your own recent silence. The rooms you are being edged out of were built for the person you were becoming smaller inside of. The visibility you had there required constant maintenance, constant explanation, constant translation of yourself into a shape other people found comfortable. That kind of visibility is expensive. It asks for performance in exchange for inclusion. When it disappears, it can feel like abandonment, but it is often closer to relief arriving in a disguise you have not yet learned to recognize. There is a specific test worth applying here, and it is uncomfortable, but clarifying. Ask yourself honestly whether the visibility you are grieving actually felt good, or did it feel like constant management of how others perceived you? Most people, when they are honest, discover it was the second one. This reframes the entire experience without dismissing how painful it feels. Grief is still real, even when the thing being grieved was quietly costing you. You are allowed to miss being included in a room that was slowly making you smaller. Both things are true at once. 7 tends to intensify exactly during this kind of protective withdrawal. It is marking the end of an arrangement your future self would not have agreed to, if asked directly. The number is not commenting on whether you deserve to be seen. It is commenting on what that particular kind of seeing was actually costing you. What makes this hard to accept in the moment is that protection rarely announces itself as protection. It shows up disguised as exclusion, as silence, as being the last to know about plans you used to be part of automatically. Only later, once the next chapter of your life has taken shape, does the earlier withdrawal start to look deliberate rather than cruel. The next layer looks at what happens after this initial protective phase. That is when invisibility stops being about escaping the wrong rooms and starts being about something quietly built, in the ones that have not appeared yet. The difference between invisible and unfinished. There is a word that describes this phase more accurately than invisible, and it is unfinished. Invisible implies you have already vanished completely. Unfinished implies something is still actively taking shape, just not yet in a form anyone else can perceive. Think about how construction sites work. The most important structural work, the foundation, the wiring, the framework holding the entire building upright, happens behind fences and tarps, completely hidden from public view. Nobody photographs a foundation. Everybody photographs the finished building. But the building would collapse without the part no one was allowed to see. You are currently in the foundation phase of something. That is a very different situation than being forgotten. This distinction matters because the emotional experience of each one is nearly identical from the inside, but the correct response to each is completely different. If you are actually forgotten, the correct response is to grieve and move on. If you are unfinished, the correct response is closer to patience and to protecting the process from premature exposure. Here is where most people sabotage themselves without realizing it. Uncomfortable with the silence, they rush to share the unfinished version of themselves publicly, hoping visibility will speed up the process. It almost never does. It usually does the opposite, forcing a half-formed idea, relationship, or identity into a shape before it is structurally ready, and it collapses under a tension it was not built to hold yet. There is a term for this in creative fields called premature exposure, where an idea shared too early loses momentum because the response to its unfinished state discourages the person from continuing to build it. The same principle applies to identity, not just to projects. 777 tends to appear specifically during this foundation stage, not the launch stage. That timing is significant. It is not celebrating an arrival. It is confirming that something structural is currently underway, hidden from view on purpose, the same way a foundation is hidden from view on purpose. This reframes the silence around you in a specific way. The people who are not currently seeing you are not being cruel. They simply do not have access to the floor beneath the tarp yet, because it is not finished, and it was never meant to be shown to them at this stage. Consider how differently you would feel about a difficult month if you knew for certain it was the framework stage of something solid, rather than proof that you had somehow become forgettable. The facts of your circumstances would not change. The meaning you assign to them would change completely. This is not a suggestion to romanticize isolation indefinitely. Foundations are temporary by design. They exist to be built upon, not to be lived in permanently. But while you are inside this stage, the correct posture is protection of the process, not panic about the silence surrounding it. The layer ahead explores what specifically withdraws during this phase. The parts of your life that quiet down first are rarely accidental, and instead follow a particular order tied directly to what is being rebuilt underneath. What withdraws before it transforms. If you pay close attention to what has quieted down in your life recently, a pattern usually emerges. It is rarely everything at once. It tends to follow a specific order, and that order tells you something about what is actually happening underneath the surface. Typically, surface relationships fade first. Acquaintances, group chats, people you saw out of habit rather than genuine connection. This layer thins out quickly and painlessly, almost like background noise fading when you finally focus on one conversation in a crowded room. Next, roles start to feel uncomfortable. A job title that used to feel like an identity starts feeling like a costume. A social role you played automatically, the funny one, the reliable one, the one who always shows up, starts requiring visible effort to maintain. Only after those two layers loosen does the deepest layer begin to shift, the internal sense of who you are when nobody is watching at all. This is the layer that actually matters, and it is also the layer that takes the longest to reach, because the noisier layers have to quiet down first before you can hear it clearly. Here is the detail almost nobody explains about this sequence. It happens in this specific order because your attention can only rebuild one layer at a time. If the surface noise never quieted, you would never have the internal bandwidth to reach the identity level underneath it. The withdrawal is not chaos, it is triage. This reframes something people often describe as their life coming undone. What actually feels like everything unraveling is frequently closer to a system clearing space, layer by layer, for something that requires quiet to be built correctly. A house cannot be renovated with the furniture still fully in place. The furniture, the surface layer, has to move out first. 777 during this period tends to concentrate around the moments the deeper layer starts to stir, not around the earlier surface losses. People often report the number intensifying weeks or months into the quiet. Right around the point they start asking bigger questions about who they actually are underneath the roles they had been playing. This timing is not coincidental. It is marking the transition from clearing to construction, from loss to assembly. The earlier chapters of this process feel almost entirely like subtraction. This stage is where addition quietly begins, even though it rarely feels like addition yet. There is a specific danger here worth naming directly. Some people, uncomfortable with how long the clearing phase takes, try to refill the surface layers immediately, adding new acquaintances, new roles, new distractions, before the deeper layer has had a chance to speak. This resets the sequence. The surface noise returns, and the quiet required to reach the identity layer disappears again. Patience here is not passive. It is protective of a process that only works in a specific order, and rushing it does not speed anything up. It only restarts the clearing phase from the beginning. What comes next explains something that confuses almost everyone in this phase. It is why certain specific people, not everyone, seem to disappear from your life during exactly this window. That particular kind of loss is revealing something about the identity underneath it. The people who stop seeing you for a reason. Not everyone fades during this season. That detail is worth sitting with because it disproves the fear that you have simply become generally forgettable to everyone at once. If invisibility were purely about your worth, it would apply evenly. It does not. Some people drift. Others, often the ones you would least expect, seem to hold steady, or even move closer during exactly the same window everyone else goes quiet. This unevenness is the clue. The people who fade tend to be the ones whose connection to you was built around the version of you that is currently dissolving. The friend who bonded with you over a shared complaint you no longer relate to. The relationship built on a role you played rather than a person you actually are. When that layer dissolves, the connection built on top of it naturally dissolves with it, not out of malice, but because the shared foundation is gone. The people who stay tend to be connected to something underneath the layer currently changing, something closer to your actual character than to your circumstances. Their steadiness is not luck. It is a signal about what kind of connection they were built on in the first place. Here is the detail that reframes the whole situation. You are not losing your ability to be seen. You are losing access to being seen incorrectly, by people whose attachment depended on a version of you that no longer matches who you are becoming. This distinction matters because it changes the correct emotional response. Mourning the loss of correct recognition, being fully seen by people who actually understand you, is appropriate and healthy. Mourning the loss of incorrect recognition, being kept around by people who only related to a costume you were wearing, keeps you tethered to relationships your own growth has already outgrown. 777 tends to intensify specifically around the moments this sorting becomes obvious. when you notice certain people pulling away while a smaller, steadier group remains unaffected. The number is marking the sort itself, not simply the loneliness surrounding it. Consider a friendship that quietly ended during a period exactly like this one, and consider honestly whether that friendship was built on shared identity or shared circumstance. Most people, looking back, can tell the difference immediately once they are asked directly. This does not make the loss painless. Losing anyone, even a connection built on the wrong version of you, still registers as loss to a nervous system that formed real attachment to that person's presence. Grief here does not require the relationship to have been ideal. It only requires that it mattered to you while it lasted. But there is relief available once the sorting is understood correctly. You are not becoming unlovable. You are becoming unavailable to a specific kind of connection that required you to stay smaller than you actually are. The next layer looks at what this sorting is quietly making room for. The attention you are losing from the wrong people was never actually the signal your instincts were searching for in the first place. Why attention from others was never the real signal. Most people spend years using other people's attention as a measurement device. If someone notices you, you must matter. If someone stops noticing you, something about your value must have decreased. This equation feels logical, but it quietly hands control of your sense of worth to people who were never qualified to hold it. Think about how often the people who validated you the loudest were not actually the people who understood you the most. Loud validation and accurate understanding are not the same thing. They get confused constantly because loud validation feels good immediately, while accurate understanding takes longer to register. This is where the invisible season is doing something quietly corrective. By removing the loud, immediate feedback you had gotten used to, it forces a different question to the surface. Not how do I get noticed again, but what do I actually think of myself when nobody else is available to tell me? That question is uncomfortable specifically because most people have never had to answer it directly. External attention had always answered it for them, layer after layer since childhood. Remove the external answer, and the internal silence that follows can feel unbearable at first. It has never been asked to speak on its own before. Here is the detail that changes how this silence should be interpreted. The discomfort is not evidence that something is wrong. It is evidence that a muscle which has never had to work on its own is finally being asked to. 677 tends to appear repeatedly during exactly this stretch. In the specific moments you catch yourself reaching for validation that is not there. It is not filling the gap. It is pointing at the gap, asking you to notice what you have been outsourcing for years. This reframes the entire season in a specific way. What feels like abandonment by other people is closer to an invitation. It is asking you to develop a form of self-recognition you never had to build before, because external attention was always doing the job. Consider the specific moments recently where you caught yourself wanting someone, anyone, to notice something you did. Notice an effort. Notice a change. Notice a struggle. Now consider how it felt in the seconds before you checked whether anyone had responded. That gap, the space between the effort and the confirmation, is exactly where this work is happening. The uncomfortable truth is that most identities built primarily on external attention are structurally unstable because they depend entirely on factors outside your control. A season that forces you away from that structure, however painful, is forcing you towards something considerably more stable underneath it. This does not mean connection stops mattering. It means connection stops being the foundation. It becomes something built on top of a foundation that can hold its own weight, without collapsing the moment attention moves elsewhere. What comes next examines what has actually been happening in the quiet itself. It is the specific internal work taking place while no one has been watching, and it matters more than the visibility you have been missing. The quiet work, happening where no one is watching. There is a specific kind of change that only happens without an audience. It is worth naming directly, because it explains why this season has felt so private, almost sealed off from other people, even the ones closest to you. Any change made while being watched is shaped at least partially by the watching. You soften certain edges, you emphasize certain qualities, you perform a version of change that is acceptable to whoever is present. This is not dishonesty. It is simply how humans behave under observation, and it is nearly impossible to avoid. Real structural change, the kind that reaches values, beliefs, and self-perception, requires a period without that shaping influence. It requires a room with no audience, where the only feedback available is internal rather than social. This is what the invisible season has actually been providing, even though it has felt like punishment rather than privacy. The isolation is not incidental to the change. It is the condition the change required to happen accurately, without being bent toward what other people expected from you. Here is the part almost nobody explains clearly. This kind of internal work is slow, specifically because it is unobserved. There is no external timeline pushing it forward. No audience expecting visible progress by a certain date. It moves at the pace actual transformation moves at, which is almost always slower than the pace people expect from the outside. 777 tends to surface heavily during this exact stretch, often in mundane, private moments, alone in a car, alone in a kitchen, alone right before sleep. That privacy is not a coincidence. The number tends to appear where the work is actually happening, not where an audience would expect a milestone to be announced. Consider what specifically has shifted internally during this quiet period, separate from anything anyone else has witnessed. A belief you used to hold automatically that you now question. A reaction you used to have instantly that now takes a pause before it arrives. A version of yourself you used to perform that now feels slightly foreign when you try it on. These shifts rarely make headlines in your own life. Nobody throws a celebration for a changed internal reaction, but structurally, they are the actual substance of the transformation everyone eventually notices from the outside, once it is finished enough to be visible again. This reframes the boredom and frustration of an unwitnessed season. What feels like nothing happening is frequently the site of the most significant happening, precisely because nothing external is available to distract from it or dilute it. There is a specific danger in rushing to make this work visible before it is finished, sharing it, announcing it, performing it for an audience eager for proof that something is changing. Doing so tends to shape the unfinished work toward what an audience wants to hear, rather than what is actually true, and the process quietly resets. The next layer looks directly at 777 itself, and at what this specific number is marking as a threshold rather than a punishment. Understanding that distinction changes how the entire experience should be carried forward from here. How 777 marks a threshold, not a punishment. By now, the pattern has probably already confirmed itself in your own memory. You have thought back through recent weeks and noticed 777 sitting quietly inside them. On a clock, on a total at checkout, on a page you happen to open at exactly the wrong or perhaps exactly the right moment. It is worth slowing down here to be precise about what this number is actually doing, because precision matters more than mystique. In numerology, 7 is consistently associated with introspection, spiritual assessment, and internal completion, distinct from numbers associated with action or external change. Tripled, its meaning intensifies rather than repeats. It stops functioning as a gentle nudge and starts functioning as a marker, the kind used to indicate a specific point has been reached, not a general theme running in the background. A threshold is not a punishment, and it is not a reward. It is a location. Standing at a threshold means one phase has genuinely ended and another has not yet fully begun. That in-between location is exactly where invisibility tends to feel strongest, because thresholds, by definition, are not fully inside either room. This explains something confusing about the entire season. It has not felt like ongoing loss. It has felt like suspension, like standing in a hallway between two doors, neither of which has opened yet. That sensation is accurate. You are standing in a hallway. 777 is confirming the hallway itself, not promising an immediate exit from it. Here is where most interpretations of this number fail people. They treat it as an instruction to wait passively for something external to arrive and resolve the discomfort. That reading misses the actual invitation. A threshold does not ask you to wait for a door to open on its own. It asks you to notice which direction you are already quietly facing, and to begin moving before the door is even visible. There is a specific psychological parallel here worth naming. Researchers studying identity development describe threshold periods, sometimes called liminal states, as phases where old roles have dissolved, but new ones have not yet solidified. These periods are consistently reported as disorienting, even distressing, regardless of whether the eventual outcome is positive. The distress is not a sign of failure. It is a known feature of the location itself. 777 appearing throughout this hallway is not decorative reassurance. It is closer to a marker on a map, confirming you have not taken a wrong turn, even though the corridor itself offers no obvious scenery to prove it. This reframes the correct response to the number entirely. It does not require a ritual, a wish, or a specific action performed at the exact moment you see it. It requires something quieter, an acknowledgement that the hallway is real, temporary, and already being walked through, whether or not it currently feels that way. What comes next examines what it actually means to become your own witness during this stretch of hallway. That particular skill, more than any external validation, is what ultimately determines how long the threshold lasts. Becoming your own witness. There is a specific skill this season is quietly forcing you to develop, and almost nobody names it directly. It is the ability to witness yourself accurately without requiring another person to do it first. Most people have never had to practice this. From childhood onward, external witnesses were nearly always present. A parent noticing an achievement, a friend noticing a struggle, a partner noticing a change in mood before you had even fully named it yourself. Being witnessed by others was so constant that most people never developed the internal equivalent, because it was never structurally necessary. This season has removed that constant external witness, at least temporarily, and the discomfort you feel is largely the discomfort of an unpracticed skill being demanded suddenly and without warning. Here is what self-witnessing actually requires, stripped of anything mystical. It requires noticing your own effort even when no one applauds it. It requires acknowledging your own growth even when no one comments on it. It requires sitting with a difficult decision and confirming to yourself that it was handled with integrity, without needing external confirmation to believe it. This sounds simple stated plainly, but it is genuinely difficult in practice, because the instinct to seek outside confirmation runs deep and activates automatically, long before conscious thought intervenes. 777 tends to function almost like a checkpoint during this specific practice. People frequently report noticing the number in the exact moments they have just done something quietly correct, spoken up for themselves, held a boundary, chosen honesty over comfort, with no one else present to notice or approve. The number arrives less like praise and more like confirmation, a private acknowledgement in a season built around privacy. This reframes the entire discomfort of feeling unseen. You have not lost the ability to be witnessed. You have been asked to become the primary witness of your own life, with external witnesses becoming secondary rather than foundational. There is a specific exercise worth trying here, not mystical, simply practical. At the end of a day inside this season, instead of measuring the day by who noticed you, measure it by what you noticed about yourself. A moment of restraint, a moment of honesty, a moment where you chose growth over comfort. Write it down if it helps. The goal is not performance for an imagined audience. The goal is building the internal witness this season is quietly training. This is not a permanent state. Self-witnessing is not meant to replace connection forever. It is meant to become the stable foundation connection can eventually rest on, rather than the thing connection is required to provide from the outside. People who successfully build this skill during an invisible season tend to describe their eventual return to visibility very differently than people who simply waited it out. The difference, and what specifically changes once real recognition returns, is what the next layer explores directly: the return of being seen and why it feels different. Every threshold eventually opens into a room. This season is not permanent, and there is a specific texture to how visibility tends to return once the internal work underneath it has genuinely completed. It rarely arrives the way people expect. Most imagine a dramatic re-entry, a sudden reversal where the same people who went quiet suddenly return with enthusiasm, and everything resumes exactly as it was before. That is almost never how it actually happens. Instead, Visibility tends to return smaller at first, and more accurate. A single new conversation that feels effortless in a way old ones never did. A small acknowledgement from someone new that lands differently than any amount of old attention ever managed to. It feels quieter than expected, and also considerably more solid. This is because the visibility returning now is being received by a different internal structure than the one that existed before the threshold began. Previously, attention landed on a version of you built partially around performance, around managing how you were perceived. Now it lands on something closer to the version that was being constructed in private, during the exact stretch of hallway just examined. Here is the detail that explains why this return feels emotionally different, even when the external circumstances look similar. Being seen accurately after a period of self-witnessing does not feel like relief from starvation. It feels like confirmation of something you had already quietly come to believe about yourself, independent of whether anyone else confirmed it first. That distinction changes everything about how the attention lands. Old visibility required constant maintenance to keep. New visibility, arriving after this kind of internal completion, tends to require considerably less effort to sustain because it is not being performed toward an external audience anymore. It is simply being witnessed. 777 during this return phase tends to shift in tone as well. People frequently describe it appearing less frequently, or appearing during specifically positive, connective moments, rather than during the isolated ones that defined the earlier part of the season. This is not the number disappearing. It is the number's function changing, from marking a threshold to confirming a completed passage through it. There is a specific caution worth naming here. Some people, uncomfortable with how differently this new visibility feels, unconsciously try to rebuild the old performance-based version out of habit, in an attempt to make the return feel more familiar. This usually backfires, reintroducing the exhaustion the earlier chapters already identified as unsustainable. The correct posture during this return is closer to allowing rather than chasing. The visibility that is arriving now was built through patience, not pursuit, and pursuing it aggressively at this stage tends to distort the very quality that made it feel different in the first place. What comes next examines what specifically is carried forward from the invisible season once it has genuinely closed. The durable qualities that remain even after the hallway itself has been left behind. What you carry back from the invisible season. There is a specific inventory worth taking once a threshold like this has closed, because not everything from the hallway gets left behind. Some of it is meant to travel forward with you, quietly reshaping how you move through visibility from now on. The first thing most people carry forward is a lowered dependency on constant confirmation. Once you have practiced witnessing your own effort without an audience, the need for immediate outside validation loses much of its former grip. This does not mean connection stops mattering. It means connection stops being the only mechanism confirming that your effort was real. The second thing carried forward is a sharper ability to distinguish real recognition from performative attention. Having lost the second kind during the season and rebuilt around the first, most people describe becoming far less tolerant of relationships that only engage with a curated, managed version of them. That intolerance is not bitterness, it is discernment, earned specifically through the discomfort of the hallway. The third thing, and the one most people underestimate in advance, is a different relationship to future invisible seasons. This will very likely not be the only one. Life tends to include several thresholds like this across a lifetime, each one preceding a genuine shift in identity or direction. Having moved through one consciously changes how the next one is met. Recognition replaces panic. Familiarity replaces fear. Here is a detail worth sitting with directly. The version of you that entered this season and the version leaving it are not the same person, even though the external circumstances of your life may look largely unchanged. The internal architecture has shifted quietly, the entire time no one was watching. 777 tends to settle into a different, calmer presence once this closing phase is reached. Many people describe it becoming almost companionable rather than urgent, a familiar marker rather than an active signal demanding attention. This shift mirrors the internal one. The threshold is not being crossed anymore. It has become part of the map you now carry, There is one final piece of this inventory worth naming honestly. Some things genuinely are lost during a season like this, and pretending otherwise does not serve you. Certain relationships end permanently. Certain versions of comfort do not return. Grieving those losses is not a failure to understand the deeper meaning of the season. It is simply part of what crossing any real threshold costs. Holding both truths at once, that something valuable was lost and something equally valuable was built, is more accurate than choosing only one narrative. Growth rarely arrives without cost, and pretending it does tends to flatten an experience that deserves to be held with more complexity than that. What remains is the final layer of this entire pattern, the specific moment where the need to be found stops driving your choices altogether, and what that shift actually looks like once it finally arrives. The moment you stop needing to be found. There is a final shift worth naming clearly because it is easy to miss even after everything already covered here. It is the moment the need to be found quietly stops driving your decisions altogether. Earlier in this season, most of your attention was aimed outward, checking who noticed, who responded, who remembered. That orientation made sense at the time. It was the instinct of someone standing in a hallway searching for a door. But somewhere in the process of witnessing yourself, naming what withdrew and why, understanding what a threshold actually is rather than what it feels like, that outward searching quietly loses its urgency, not because you have given up on connection, but because connection has stopped being the thing your sense of self depends on to feel real. This is the actual completion this entire pattern has been pointing toward. Not a return to constant visibility, not a guarantee that you will never feel unseen again. Real completion looks like reaching a point where being seen becomes something you enjoy, rather than something you require. Here is what that shift tends to look like in ordinary moments. A room you enter without immediately scanning it for approval. A silence from someone that no longer sends you searching for what you might have done wrong. A version of yourself, shown honestly, that no longer waits for permission before existing fully in front of other people. 777 rarely disappears entirely once this stage is reached. It tends to become quieter, appearing occasionally as a familiar signature rather than an urgent message. Its earlier intensity was proportional to the depth of the threshold. Once the threshold has genuinely closed, the number settles into something closer to a signature than a summons. There is a specific kind of peace available here that does not depend on external circumstances lining up perfectly. It depends on no longer needing them to in order to feel like yourself. That peace is not the absence of connection. It is connection finally arriving from a stable place rather than a starving one. Look back at the entire season. From the first realization that no one had noticed you leave a room, through the slow sorting of relationships, the private construction work, the threshold, and finally this quieter arrival, a clear shape emerges. What felt like disappearance was never disappearance at all. It was assembly, happening exactly where it needed to happen, away from an audience that was never meant to witness it until it was finished. You were not forgotten during this season. You were simply, briefly out of view. Something more solid than the old visibility was being built underneath you, patiently, on a timeline that never once needed anyone's permission or attention to keep moving forward. That work is yours now, whether or not anyone else ever fully understands what it cost or what it quietly became.